Music. It's the love of music that brings us together. The love of music that forms the bond between us. For the next hour, join us for the love of music, presenting those aspects of music which excite, provoke, and inspire. Our host today is David Dubal, WNCN music director, pianist, educator, and writer on music. Here is David Dubal for the love of music.
It is my pleasure today to have as my guest my dear colleague who I work with every day at WNCN. His name is Sedgwick Clark, and he is well known as the editor of our dear magazine here. Indeed, it must be, because it's WNCN's program guide, and it is also, with its many articles about the arts, Keynote magazine. Sedgwick Clark, I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you, David.
We will plug the Keynote magazine, of course, because it's an important part of our radio station. However, the main gist of this program will be, and we were discussing it before, the Cantelli Legacy, which is an article in this month's issue of Keynote. Who, for the general public who does not really know his work, was Guido Cantelli?
Guido Cantelli was a very fine conductor who sort of was taken on by Toscanini as his protege. Toscanini saw him conduct a rehearsal at La Scala in 1948, and he felt that that was him. He felt that Cantelli had the same temperament, the same musical integrity that was necessary to really make great music. And he took Cantelli on and invited him immediately to the NBC Symphony, which he conducted. And Cantelli's career took off very quickly. Many think he would have been one of the greatest conductors that the world had ever known. Cantelli, however, died in an airplane crash in 1956 on the way to conduct the New York Philharmonic.
At the age of what?
He was 36 years old. And the amazing thing about it is, or at least it seems amazing to us right now, he would have been 60 years old on the 27th of April.
Not even old, Sedgwick, huh? So there's something in common with Lapati and Capel, in that this was one of the early slaughtered great talents of his generation. And
absolutely.
What a pity. Did he make many records?
He didn't make enough records. That's the unfortunate thing. But the records that he made were, I think anyway, very great. You've got things like the Schumann Fourth, which in my estimation is the best Schumann Fourth I've ever heard.
Tell us about this article we have in Keynote for the April issue.
Well, Cantelli, unfortunately, as with Toscanini, suffers from the same problem, and that is when a conductor dies, his records just generally stop selling.
This is a great problem. Composers have a chance to live on. They were neglected in their day, and performers who were even stars, the moment their availability for performance is gone, their records die out and they're out of print.
Many think Toscanini was the greatest conductor we've ever had, and yet his records just simply do not sell very well now. They're in mono, the fidelity is very restricted, and many people just won't buy them even though the performances are greater than, let's say, Maestro X's, just recorded last year in the latest digital sound.
Mm-hmm. But now, sound, of course, Sedgwick, is a very big item in your own listening experience.
To me, it's very important. I can listen, however, to an acoustic recording with all the scratching, all of the noise that most people are very put off by, and I have a feeling, yes, okay, I can listen to it because it's from that era. What I can't stand is bad recording that's done today.
I see. In our Cantelli performance, which will be the first movement of the Unfinished, you have an interesting example to play for us.
Well, we are going to play first the introduction of the first movement on the Seraphim pressing. It's in mono. Now, recently, stereo tapes were discovered, and it was released in stereo in England. Now, what I'd like to see now is the difference in sound that stereo brings, and of course also the difference between American processing and the mastering that's done over in England.
The actual pressing there and here, right?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
I think you'll hear a very big difference as we listen to the introduction of the Schubert Unfinished. Now, let's hear the British pressing of this same performance. It is so realistic. It sounds like you're there in the hall, and the orchestra just spreads out with all the beauty and depth that one could imagine.
We'll now hear the British pressing then, right?
Yes, of the entire first movement.
Wonderful. The orchestra, Sedgwick, is?
This is the Philharmonia Orchestra.
With Cantelli conducting. This program is devoted to the art of Guido Cantelli, and we have just heard the first movement of the unfinished symphony, the second most popular symphony ever composed. Cantelli conducting the Philharmonia, the orchestra, and after this message we will return with more on Cantelli with my guest, Keynote's editor, Sedgwick Clark. Let's now return to our topic today, Guido Cantelli. My guest is my colleague Sedgwick Clark, the editor of Keynote magazine. Keynote is an important magazine for the arts, Sedgwick, and I know it sounds probably like a ridiculous question, but I'm going to ask you, how come it's an important magazine? I know you feel that, but I would like more subscriptions, and perhaps you could give it a little hype. There's certainly no reason not to.
Well, you're sort of putting me on the spot here.
Of course I am.
Well,
and I know you don't like to do commercials, so to speak, but this is not a commercial. You can tell us what's in the April issue. I haven't read it yet.
Well, in the April issue, we have what I think is a very interesting article by Eugenia Zuckerman talking
Yes.
about orchestra power, who's in charge of the orchestras these days.
How interesting.
The orchestra, the conductor, the board of directors, the management, and it's a question that doesn't have any answers, but she asks the right questions, I think.
So it's an interesting article, and the Cantelli article is another major article on a conductor. What else?
We also have an article by Donald Spoto, an expert on the films of Alfred Hitchcock. What he's written for us is an article about Hitchcock's use of sound and music in his films. Bernard Herrmann, of course, was the composer who did so many films for Hitchcock. And Spoto gets into talking about why they worked so well together. It's not on classical music, but it is on music, and it's something I think is very interesting.
How interesting, because music in the films is a subject that is by no means exhausted. For instance, Copland wrote some very interesting music for the films.
Sure,
Yeah.
William Walton. And
I mean, it's been a way for contemporary composers to make some money, of course, as well as producing interesting music. What's in future issues of Keynote? We're speaking of April right now.
Well, in the future, okay, we have in the May issue coming up an article on Picasso's use of instruments in his Cubist works, like, for instance, the guitar and the violin. And there's going to be a big Picasso retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, and I thought that this would tie in very interestingly. And while we're on the subject with WNCN, we're going to play all of the ballets that Picasso designed for.
That's right.
Parade, Three-Cornered Hat, Pulcinella. Unfortunately, he didn't design as many as we would like, but I know that what you did was to program them one evening.
Yes, well, you and I, of course, being together daily, we try to coordinate certain of the aspects of Keynote with our programming. And naturally, one of the great parts of Keynote magazine is that we get every single piece with the timings and with the record company and so forth in Keynote. Keynote is quite a lavish magazine, isn't it?
Well, one of the things, okay, it's lavish, but one of the things that I find as an editor that's so good about Keynote is that for this Cantelli legacy, we have an article, and we've programmed all of Cantelli's recordings available at present in the U.S. and in Britain. This involved our obtaining a lot of records from England, because I believe there are only 4 or 5 records by Cantelli now available in the United States. And so we got from EMI sources over there a number, I think 5 other records. And people will be hearing them all throughout the next month in April. This, I think, is one of the really fine opportunities of working on a magazine like this, because the writer can write about a subject, and then the listener can read the article and listen to the recordings, maybe at the same time if they wish.
Well, I see that at 9 p.m. on the 8th you'll hear the Tchaikovsky Fifth, and so you have also all of the works programmed here for the person to see, not only in our composer index in the back, but here in a special place. A little more, Sedgwick, on the Cantelli legacy.
Well, unfortunately, we can't program all of the things because they're not all available. There are a lot of recordings that he made which are very important recordings, like there's a recording of Hindemith's Mathis der Maler, Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, just to name a couple of them, and they're not available now. Now, about a year ago, EMI planned to re-release all of the Cantelli recordings. RCA owns rights to a few with the NBC Symphony, one of which we're going to be playing, the Franck Symphony, in April. But the problem is right now the record industry seems to be having a belt-tightening exercise, and so maybe these won't come out. I don't know. Everyone will be hearing these records, and I think we'll be able to tell just how great they are. And the best way to encourage the companies to continue the Cantelli series is to go out and buy the records. Now, also, I'm hoping that people find that these records are so good that they write letters to the companies and say, hey, let's have some more of these things. And if they write letters to me, what I'll do is send them on to the companies.
That would be fine. How many are available again?
Right now, in the United States, there are only 5 records. Now, I'll tell you something extraordinary. At least to me it's extraordinary. Already, one of our subscribers got this and read it and called me up and said, why aren't you doing the Vivaldi Four Seasons? And I said, well, we don't have it. And he said, look, I'm going to send you this record. You should have it in your library. And the man brought it over himself just the other day, and we put it in the library now. And in the future, we're going to be able to program the Cantelli performance of the Four Seasons.
Indeed, we now have that, and it's another example of the extraordinary listeners that this station has.
Well, it seems that they feel it's sort of a family, and that this fellow should give the record to us to share with all of the listeners. I think that's wonderful.
Sedgwick Clark, editor of Keynote, I am going to interrupt our conversation for a minute or so when we have a message from our announcer. We are back. My guest, Sedgwick Clark, the editor of Keynote magazine. For those who are interested in subscribing to this magazine, Keynote, WNCN's Pride, 757-5650. Do you mind me giving that number, Sedgwick?
Well, if you must.
Well, you know, to sell the magazine, it would be very important to have this number out. So I'll say it again, 757-5650. I know you're very uncommercial minded, and it's difficult for you to say that number, so I'll say it. Cantelli is our subject. He was a conductor of the Romantic literature, first and foremost, correct?
And yet, Toscanini would get very upset, not very upset, but he'd wonder, why do you conduct things like the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra? He just simply didn't understand this music. Music that to
Toscanini
us,
didn't know.
Yes, Toscanini didn't. To us, it's basic repertoire.
Sure.
The music for strings, percussion, celesta, Hindemith's Mathister Mahler. Toscanini didn't understand it. He thought that this was a passing phase that maybe Cantelli would get over.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's always been a slight problem with many people's viewpoint of Toscanini. He didn't do a great deal for contemporary music. Cantelli was really born into such interesting orchestral works as the Hindemith you spoke of and the Bartók. It was in his blood already.
And listen to those, well, you can't hear those performances, unfortunately. That's the problem. That's the annoyance of the whole situation.
Speak to me for a moment of the Italian Symphony, which is another one of his recordings.
Well, the pressing we're going to hear is once again the EMI pressing, which has just come out within the past year over in London. And once again, the sound is much improved over the domestic Seraphim. And I believe we're going to hear the last movement of it.
Yes.
Here's a performance of it that, for me, once again, it sings. I've heard performances of this last movement that are just brutal, hammering away. Okay, it's Mark Presto, but it's not a brutal piece of music. And it sings. It has dynamism, and yet it still sings under Cantelli.
Sedgwick, are we going to hear the Philharmonia or the La Scala?
It's the Philharmonia.
Here is Guido Cantelli in the last movement of the celebrated Italian Symphony by Felix Mendelssohn. A truly wonderful performance with the Philharmonia Orchestra of Guido Cantelli conducting the last movement of the Italian Symphony, and we'll hear that whole work in April. Any more words on Cantelli before we close today's program?
Well, nothing except to say that I hope that everyone listens to these recordings and reads the article also.
Can you give me a hint of what we're doing in the May issue?
Well, in the May issue, one of the things we're doing to tie in with Keynote is an interview by Philip Ramey with Ned Rorem, who you chose as the composer of the month.
Yes.
And we're going to hear a lot of his works over the air. We're going to find out that he's not just a song composer.
Indeed not. And it's nice to occasionally do a living composer for our composer of the month.
It's something that I feel is important. We did Barber this month, and we had one lady write in and say that she wouldn't have tuned in to Composer of the Month because he was a contemporary composer. But she read the article, she liked it, she listened to the music, and she loved it.
So you see, this magazine then has importance.
Well, it's the kind of a thing that makes an editor's heart so warm.
Well, if it turned on one listener to listen to Barber's music, it surely succeeded that issue, right? Sedgwick Clark, Keynote's editor, my guest today on For the Love of Music. This is David Dubal. Thank you for listening.
For the Love of Music, with today's host, David Dubal, WNCN Music Director. We hope you'll be with us when once again we meet to listen and exchange ideas, all for the love of music. For the Love of Music is produced by WNCN New York, GAF Broadcasting Company.